Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to people like you. With us on the program today is Natalie Klein. She is a candidate for U.S. House of Representatives in West Virginia's 1st Congressional District. She is a computational linguist. We totally get to explore that skill set a little bit in the second half of our conversation. But, in our first part, we got to talk about what inspired her to run for office, as well as, what are the reforms we need in our democracy, as well as in our government to make sure that, they are representing the needs of our people so that we can start tackling some of the crises in our country. And then in the second part of our conversation, we dive deep into her top priority, which is addressing the opioid epidemic, as well as, as I said beforehand, talking about the linguistic skills that we need for the, Democratic Party, progressives, independents, anyone who is trying to advance our common sense agenda. With that being said, I had a blast getting to hear from Natalie today. I loved her, pragmatic approach of how do you speak to people, as well as understanding that we should be pushing only so far depending on the composition of Congress. So I had a great time being able to hear from her, and I know you are too. So let's get into it. Okay, we are here with Natalie Klein. She is a congressional candidate in West Virginia's 1st District. Natalie, it's a pleasure to have you on today. Welcome to the Hill of Roses.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're quite welcome. So, I like to start with every congressional candidate that I have on. They see a lot of politicians out there, and we want to see the human behind the campaign. And so I think a lot of people think, what inspired someone to take that leap to go and run for Congress? It can be a daunting prospect for a lot of people. What was that thing that inspired you to run for office, and what were you doing before you were running for office?
So for me, it was when we chose to move back. My husband and I are both natives of the district in West Virginia, and we both grew up here in the 80s. I grew up down the street from my grandmother. He grew up down the street from his. And we were living in the DC metro area for about 5 years working. And our son was born when we lived in DC. When he was 2, we decided we wanted to move back here. We wanted him to be raised in a very close-knit community. And we wanted him to be able to know his family and experience growing up in West Virginia, much as we did here in the 80s. So his grandmother had passed away, so we purchased her house. We were 2 doors away from my in-laws. So we're accomplishing these goals of our son gets to know his family. He knows that he's getting that close-knit community experience. But it was very apparent when we moved back that a lot had changed, even though we'd only been gone about 5 years. And it just really weighed on me, and I could not get past it. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I had my son here and I chose to move him back here. I couldn't get over how ravaged our state has been from the opioid epidemic.
Yeah.
And for me, like, that bleeding heart started, occurring. And I had, like, at the time, my son was only 2, and I'm looking at his cohort and thinking, like, what a failure we have done at every level of government for these kids. We have a state that has essentially been targeted by the pharmaceutical industry. We have politicians at every level of government who take campaign donations from the pharmaceutical industry, not to mention other large corporations. And we are literally watching our population suffer the side effects of addiction. And there isn't anybody here who doesn't know someone who is an addict, related to someone who's an addict, or is potentially an addict themselves. And for me, the more I started talking to friends who are teachers and mental health professionals and physicians, the more I was really understanding that in West Virginia, our teachers are our first line of defense for our kids. And we see our teachers, even when they were on strike, making sure that our kids get nutritious meals, and they're packing lunches for them and taking care of them. But there's one thing they can't do, and that's take our kids to the doctor. And it just really bothers me because I think like we've failed them so much and we're not investing in making sure that they are taken care of in the future. So for me, a lot of policy positions were born in response to that, and the campaign was launched.
Yeah, I think honestly, this is something I've heard from several of the candidates I've gotten to interview from West Virginia. It's really, the opioid epidemic tends to be a big one, and it also comes down to climate change. And they kind of have this root cause in common, which is there's big money that's standing in the way of this progress. I'd love to focus in, first and foremost on how do we stop this influence? What is your plan? One of the big pillars of the Hill of Roses is we want to be able to do democracy and government reform. What do you
Absolutely.
see as the answer to be able to stop this influence peddling and be able to try and get big money out of our politics?
You got to hold your politicians responsible. Start supporting, promoting, and voting for those who don't take corporate cash. You cannot expect any politician who's taking corporate cash to not vote in the best interests of that corporation if legislation hits their desk that can impact that corporation, whether or not it can negatively impact your constituents. Money is always the bottom line, no matter what the problem is. You always follow the money. And it's pretty obvious, I think, to everybody nowadays, no matter which political party you belong to, that money is driving our politics. Sorry if you're hearing the background noise. My son, it's bedtime and I hear the
See,
art
that's the
happening.
thing. Working class people, they when they try and run for office, they still got to deal with raising kids and such. But
Yeah.
first is obviously the transparency of knowing who's taking it. What
Mhm.
else do you think needs to be done on a democracy reform front?
We do need to number one, we need to get money out of politics in the way that it is. So back to what we were just talking about, we need candidates who don't take corporate cash. I know it's a Democratic trend right now, but it's absolutely necessary. It's the only way we're going to get past that. We also need to start setting term limits.
Hmm, totally agree.
And when you start looking at our politicians and you look at their finances historically, I don't think you're going to find any who have not increased their wealth drastically
Yeah.
the longer they're in office. And it's the simple fact that you get portfolios and you kind of you're in this world and you're privy to information, and it might not be illegal.
You're
Um,
making a lot in salary too. Let's just be frank.
but yeah, you
174K a
get
year is pretty damn good.
yeah, your salary's great. You're in power. You can propose legislation that can benefit industries
Pretty
that
good healthcare plan, as we've seen from Trump getting
great
all the healthcare he wants.
healthcare,
Yeah.
costs are low, travel's reimbursed. Lots of things go into this. But when you have politicians who have been in office for a decade and more, their wealth just amasses.
Mhm.
And at the same time, like, how in touch can they actually be with their constituents and understand what their constituents are going through and living? I know in West Virginia, we have quite a few wealthy politicians. Meanwhile, our state is in poverty. So I don't quite understand how they can claim to be in touch with their voters.
So I have to ask you, obviously there's a lot of lines that can be drawn on what's considered corporate money or, influence peddling. What is the line that you try to set? And for like, if people wanted to say, I don't want to take a corporate candidate, how do you try and guide them to understand if the candidate that they're, potentially considering is corporate?
You can look at people's FEC reports and see who their donors are. So anybody that's donated to a federal candidate, states are always different on how the reports are presented and where to find them. But speaking as a federal candidate, you can look at an FEC report, and anyone who has contributed $200 or more to that candidate, it is recorded and is there for public viewing. And in this, you're going to be able to see, which corporations, which PACs, super PACs are donating to candidates. Myself, the only like PAC money I've taken are from PACs that are fundraising specifically to distribute evenly amongst all Democrats.
Okay.
So I think it's called It Starts Tomorrow. And then there's another one that was formed by the people who formed Act Blue, where basically, a bunch of money goes into this PAC and it gets evenly distributed amongst candidates. And I just think it's so entertaining when people try to say, but you've taken corporate PAC money. I wish I would have thought about this and I would have brought the check downstairs, because the last check that I deposited from it was 68 cents in PAC money. So, I mean, these are right, big influence there. But these are literally evenly distributed amongst Democrats in a fair and just way, where they're not going to be able to buy my vote with 68 cents. I'm sorry. I hope they're not trying to.
Yeah, you're worth more than that.
Right. Meanwhile, I'm running against a guy who has taken PAC money from over 200 different PACs in this cycle alone, and over 64 of them are corporations.
Yeah. So, in your mind, how do you try and elevate this in voters' consciousness? Because I think obviously there is going to be somewhat of an advantage taking this corporate PAC money. You can flood the airwaves with more advertisements about yourself. How do you try to stay competitive so that we can get the legislation so no one can take advantage of that corporate PAC money? How have you been trying to message this to your voters as a big sticking point?
It's hard. I talk about it constantly, and that's really what you can do. So when you are a candidate who takes the corporate PAC money, I would imagine that life as a candidate is much easier. You just wake up and the money's already in your bank account, and you're not on the ground like I am. I do 2-3 of these a night. It feels like, a call with somebody. Pre-COVID, I was doing 2 and 3 in-person town halls a week, and these were town halls that I organized, that my campaign organized. Not to mention, if there was another event that we were invited to, we were there. We were on the ground. We were talking to people. But if you're taking corporate PAC money, you don't necessarily need to do nearly as many handshakes and talk to people one-on-one to get your message out there. When you're taking that kind of PAC money, then you can buy TV commercials, which, by the way, are insanely expensive. It's out of the question for our campaign. It's never going to happen. So it's not even something we aspire to do. You can buy all of the airtime that you want. Also, mailings are very expensive.
Yeah.
We are doing postcards to voters, handwritten postcards. I can show you one here, but like just getting a postcard, you have the cost to purchase it, from your printer, which ends up being roughly 30 some cents by the time you break it down. But then a postcard stamp is 35 cents, and you're thinking, well, that's really cheap. Well, yeah, for one. But when you're talking about tens of thousands of postcards that are handwritten, you're really talking about thousands of dollars in postcard material and postage just to try to get your message out there. Meanwhile, you have other candidates who are taking this kind of money, and they can just afford to print out these nice big glossies that they can do the bulk mail, where they don't even have to know what your name or address is. They just automatically get delivered by the post office to every household in a neighborhood.
So I have to ask, Natalie, let's say we're able to overcome this opponent who is taking this corporate PAC money. What is your plan of attack for, legislating so we can get some money out of politics? I think a lot of people will talk about Citizens United, but largely it seems like we would need to get a whole constitutional amendment to overturn that corporate personhood. What are some things that you would try to pass if you were elected into office to handle, reforming our democracy?
Absolutely overturning Citizens United. It's necessary. We need additional campaign finance reform.
Okay.
And I don't know that just, overturning Citizens United is going to do it. I think it almost might be easier to have multiple pieces of legislation that are much more granular, that are chipping away at the problem. It really depends on what the representation looks like, I think. As to the likelihood of getting some kind of big sweeping bill passed. If the representation come, January, when everyone takes office, is of the mentality that, PAC money is good, we don't need term limits, then you're going to have to start proposing smaller pieces of legislation that, get rid of a super PAC. You know, have reasonable term limits. Say that someone's political office cannot send 8x10 glossy mailers at the, cost of the taxpayers to promote all of their accomplishments that really look like campaign materials and are really borderline illegal. Make it a lot more difficult, because that is also something that's occurring too. I mean, we've gotten 2 already from my opponent, and they were paid for by the taxpayers.
Oh, that's gotta hurt when you feel like you funded your opponent's own ad.
Yeah, and I know how much this stuff cost, because here I am talking to you about a postcard costing 35 cents to print and another 35 cents to mail. Like, I literally know how much every single thing costs and where every penny goes. But meanwhile, anyone who's in office, when you get these large budgets for your office, you can kind of skirt the law a little bit and send these communications to your constituents, but really all it is fluffing up your next campaign. It's not actually communicating policy and ideas and talking to people and asking them what they need.
Yeah. And, I like the point that you made beforehand, which is it's going to matter a lot what the composition of Congress is. We've certainly been able to pass, through the House, like stuff like the For the People Act and other forms of democracy reform. But we still got to get the Senate. So if we don't have a large margin there, we're going to have to go for simpler, maybe not as bold proposals. So I think you're absolutely right. You can only promise so much. It's going to matter a lot about what shows up come 2021 in the halls of Congress.
Yeah.
With that being said, I think this is the perfect point to take a break and transition into, let's say we get the reform democracy in place. What are the solutions? We obviously talked about dealing with the opioid crisis is a big thing. So when we come back in our second part, we'll talk policies of what we can hopefully accomplish if we get a government that represents us truly. Okay, we're here with Natalie Klein. We just had the first part of our conversation talking with Natalie about the inspirations for her campaign, as well as, largely how do we reform our democracy and government so that it can actually get through all the necessary solutions that the people are clamoring for out there. With that conversation underfold, let's talk about some of those issues we want to address, the first of which you brought up in our first part, which is the opioid epidemic. Obviously there's been some minor legislation that's been occurring under the Trump term to put more funding into, drug treatments. But what are you trying to look for as a comprehensive approach to be able to finally tackle the opioid epidemic and get it under control?
Yeah, so I have I think, a very unique position on this, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It's had pretty good reception so far, and I think that we need representatives who are from districts that have been ravaged by the opioid crisis presenting these types of ideas, because we know firsthand what is happening. So when about 2 years ago, when I decided to do this, and I'm doing this crazy thing of jumping into politics and not having a political background, and what's the first thing you do? You start enumerating a list of all of the issues that you care about. And within 5 minutes, the list was so long. It was long enough that we actually put it on a banner, much like the banner that's behind me now. But I don't have that one behind me because you can never see the whole thing. Right. But we kept noticing, like, number one, there are way too many issues on this list. That's, a failure of government. And number two, when you realize how the vast majority of them are interconnected. And when you're looking at a state like West Virginia, and you realize that a lot of these are side effects of the opioid crisis. So, when you're talking about, addiction, mental health, imprisonment, homelessness, a lot of the issues that are happening in our public schools, food scarcity, joblessness, the fact that West Virginia has over 7,000 children in foster care alone when we only have 1.8 million people in our state, and that we have coined a new term called grand families. And that is because 11% of our kids now live in a household that fits that term of grand families. And all of this is a side effect of the opioid epidemic. So for me, as I mentioned before, looking at my son's cohort and the issues that surround them as they grow up, and I feel like they've been robbed of their childhood. And we can talk a lot about, campaign finance reform and try to get to the point where our politicians are not able to take money from the pharmaceutical industry or other large corporations. We can try to get to those points, and we know it's going to take a long time. But in my opinion, if our government is allowing politicians to take this kind of money and allowing this type of thing to happen to our communities, then our federal government should be able to provide the funds to clean it up. Our federal government should be providing the money to get us better. So the very first piece of legislation that we proposed, it's almost 2 years old now. We're calling it the Family Reinvestment Act. And what it is it's essentially FEMA, but for medical and social crises.
Okay.
So this was obviously pre-COVID. COVID is a much bigger medical crisis, but there are a lot of communities across this country, not just in West Virginia, that have been ravaged by the opioid epidemic. So the Family Reinvestment Act would be able to come in and provide federal funds that would open medical clinics, rehabilitation centers, and mental health programs in our communities. And it would do this on a per capita and like statistical incidence thing. So looking at the data, figuring out what the population is and what the incidence of addiction is, and making sure that we are meeting the needs so that every person who needs a bed has a bed. Every person who needs treatment can see a physician. Mm-hmm. But my biggest caveat in this, and it will be like the hill that I die on with this piece of legislation, is that it also goes into our public schools. So in these communities, we must make sure that the public schools are getting some of this funding to have school nurses, mental health programs, and counselors. Because right now in West Virginia, we have a problem. We have an issue where we might have one school nurse who travels between 3 schools for her full-time job. So not only do we have a state that's addicted and kids who are starving and their teachers are giving them a meal, but the teachers legally cannot take that child to a physician, but we don't even have a school nurse in their school every single day for them to see if they are sick. We don't have anyone for them to talk to if they need counseling. We don't have mental health programs for them. And we're not alone as a state. We're not the only state experiencing this. So if we want to change the face of addiction and we want to get better and become healed and actually reinvest in our families, we need to make sure we are starting with the next generation so the same thing doesn't happen to them. And then maybe by the time they're adults, the politicians will figure it out and get some campaign finance reform accomplished on the books and, overturn Citizens United. But I anticipate it taking that 15, 20 years for that to happen.
Yeah, I personally really like how you take this intersectional method to, the opioid epidemic, because I think there's a lot of underlying factors that drive someone to use some pain management system that is unhealthy for themselves. And I think you're absolutely right that we should be starting young. But I wanted to clarify one point with you is, a lot of these drugs currently are, not necessarily being taken legally. Like they'll take prescription drugs and then, the costs for those tend to be higher, and they transition to some other, black market forms of opioids, such as like heroin. I would ask you, do you think these drugs should remain illegal? Do you believe that they should be decriminalized? What's your stance on the legality of drugs in general and, maybe caveats for marijuana and such?
So I think that the class of drug makes a huge difference. I guess that's the best way to say it. Yeah. Number one, I have seen what happens when you infiltrate a community with opioids and how quickly addiction happens. And this is a real addiction. This is addiction. This is not recreational use. It is addiction. And it destroys you, and it destroys your family, and it destroys your community. That is much, much different than what marijuana and cannabis does to people.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, these are entirely two different issues.
Mhm.
And I don't think that I could ever support legalizing opioids. I just don't, I don't, after living here and seeing what it has done, it's not something we need in our lives.
How about decriminalized, though? I can understand saying you don't want to have them legalized, but
Mhm.
I think the question that I have is if someone is using these opioids and they're found to be consuming them, should they be locked up and put in prison for that? Like that's, I think, the dynamic we're trying to figure out.
So I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you yet on decriminalization as far as opioids go. I'm not there.
Okay. That's fair.
I'm not there with it. However, I think there's a different issue. I think the issue is we are not actually treating anybody, and we are, our current prison system is not helping them out in any way, shape, or form, essentially. So I think that we need to be looking at treatment. I think it still should be criminalized. Honestly, I really do think that, but we need to be treating people and trying to make them better as a priority. So there's that. Now, as far as marijuana is concerned, I think the federal government needs to legalize it.
Okay.
There's no reason not to. There's just no reason not to. It is not the same thing, and the amount of money that states could, be able to reinvest into our infrastructure and our public schools from the taxation of marijuana is incredible. And when you look at states like West Virginia, where it's already like our number one cash crop anyway, what it could do to help an impoverished state is significant. So I think that those are two different issues.
Yeah. No, I mean, I generally agree with the cause of making marijuana legal. I
Mhm,
tend to stray towards the decriminalization of other forms of drugs, but I
mhm.
think just the legalization of marijuana is actually going to help with the opioid crisis because it is also a commonly used pain management medication for a lot of people. And
Yeah,
it is certainly less detrimental than some of these opioids are. So I think that's going
absolutely.
to also be able to help address it. But with
Yeah.
that being said, let's transition now to the final part of the conversation I'd like to have, which is around strategy. Obviously, there is a lot of good ideas, but they remain just ideas until we have the people in the halls of Congress, strategizing how they get it through. And I'd
Mhm.
love to ask, what's your general, mindset of how you'd want to be a leader if you are to be elected? Are you going to be, trying to be antagonistic with colleagues and just standing with the people? Are you a relationship builder? What's your general approach to trying to legislate, hopefully?
So I feel like I get along with everybody
Mm,
most of the time. But I'm very passionate about what I'm passionate about. So for us as a campaign, and I myself, when this whole thing started, I mean, I think I mentioned before that we were doing town halls in person that we were creating on our own. And to me, one of the most important things about our campaign is communication. And I want to be able to maintain that. Like, we have a little widget on our website where people can literally click a day and a time. It's like 2 clicks, and they're scheduled for a one-on-one phone call with me. And it's a personal phone call, and it's with me. It's not with somebody from the campaign. And that's one of the things that I would like to maintain. And I feel like there's no way that you can successfully legislate if you don't understand what your constituents need and what they want. And as far as working with other people, I feel like this candidacy has shown me how easy it is to build relationships. And I find it kind of sad that we don't have more of that right now in our country. So, for example, I'm a member of this one particular coalition called No Dem Left Behind.
yep.
And, there's about a dozen congressional candidates in there. And I feel like they're my sisters and my brothers at this point. And, if we get elected, of course, they're going to be some of my first phone calls. And they also have their own networks that they've built. And the same holds true inside of West Virginia. I joined a movement called West Virginia Can't Wait because I believe and not taking corporate cash and not crossing a picket line. And those are some of the tenements of it. But being part of that, I have also grown as a candidate where I've established relationships with the other congressional candidates who are running in the state, as well as Paula Jean Swearingen, who's running for Senate, and a lot of our local and state candidates as well, and current, sitting members, where I know people now on a one-on-one basis where I feel like I would just be able to pick up a phone and, run an idea past them, or say, will you co-sponsor this bill? And vice versa, do the same for them. And it's just all relationship building. And I just don't feel like it's that hard if you're just not so antagonistic all the time. It doesn't have to be an us versus them type of a mentality. I'm very liberal. I'm very progressive. I very much dislike the current administration. But that doesn't mean we have to be unwilling to work together.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of candidates right now, at least, just in my own conversations, kind of feel the same way, because when you run as a grassroots candidate, it's hard. And you're so appreciative of anybody who is willing to have a real conversation with you and, help you along the way. So I'm hopeful that because we have seen so many people like us decide to throw their hat in the ring, that we can actually see a different type of mentality in the halls of Congress, one that is one willing to work together.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you on, I think there's been a lot of coalition building in this campaigning process, and we are hoping all of these Democrats that you had just mentioned and the no Dems left behind are able to get through. But, I'd love to ask, for the general, kind of progressive movement, as you said, you're a very liberal, very progressive person. What do you think is something that they're not doing particularly well now to be able to build those coalition sizes? Because I think a lot of the legislation that is talked about in progressive circles is very popular, but we are struggling to get, even the majority of Dems on board with these ideas. What do you think that the progressives need to be doing to increase coalition size? Is it just, electorally and primarying these people, or is there anything else that they could be doing?
Stop overlooking areas that, you would typically ignore because they're not a swing state. If you want to get the majority of the country behind you, and by the way, when you ask people questions with different linguistics behind it, we all tend to agree on the same thing anyway. But stop ignoring the vast majority of the United States and talk to people the way people want to be spoken to. And that goes a long way. Instead of talking at them or immediately discarding them. And I know as a rural Democrat that I feel that constantly. And I'm not knocking any candidate, or any movement or party in this. Everybody does it. Everybody goes and they look at the math of what they need to win and what they need to get their message out there and get their bill passed. But if you want to talk about actual support and being able to make long-term change and play the long game, you need to start talking to middle America. And also, I know this is going to sound like super weird and super nerdy, but I am a linguist by education and by career. And one of the things that I do in my job is I work for a software company, and when we're programming our linguistics into our software, words have what we call sentiment scores. And these are very quantitative. The math supports it. The research supports it. Scores on words. And you're able to run a document, like an email through or a text message through our software or whatever, and you get a score back. And that score gives you an insight as to whether or not the author of the text was trying to persuade someone or incite violence or just report some facts or make you feel like you no longer have control of your own emotions. And I feel like the Republican Party understands linguistics. They have understood this for 20 years, and they have used it to their marketing gain. And we need to either call them out or get on board. And it all comes back down to how you talk to people. And as a party, we're not doing a very good job of it. I really hate to say it. We're missing middle America.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. We have to try and talk to people in the language that they want to be talked to. This isn't a radical idea. This is basic salesmanship 101. I'd love to, ask, as this is the final question, could you give us some examples of, some linguistic missteps that you think the Democratic Party does when trying to talk to middle America voters?
Oh my. Yeah. I think the biggest one is what happened, and it started happening during the Obama administration, and then we saw it in 2016 with coal. When national politicians start talking about re-educating coal miners and replacing coal, and just the rhetoric was a very dismissive of your feelings and your job experience. And then the other party's able to see this, and they're like, oh, this is golden. We're going to call it a war on coal. Thank you so much, Democrats, for giving us this opportunity, because that's exactly what happened. And instead, Democrats could have been like, hey, you know what? West Virginia, at least, identifies with coal mining. The reason this country even has unions to begin with is because in West Virginia, we fought a literal war at the Battle of Blair Mountain and won the right to organize, setting a precedent in this country. So you betcha we identify with coal. Every single one of us understands that coal is part of our history and part of our identity, and you don't dismiss it. And that's the attitude that West Virginians felt. And that's the attitude that miners in Kentucky felt and other states felt. What you do is you come in and you say, my God, you have powered this country for 100 years. And I am so sorry that energy companies are not buying coal like they used to. What we need to do is we need to start giving those same tax incentives that we gave to those coal companies and to the oil and gas companies, to some of these other alternative energy companies and manufacturing and production companies, so that they can come in here and give you a job. And we're going to do you one better, because we're going to make sure you get the job, and they can't bring people from Oklahoma in here anymore. And we're going to put in that legislation that they are required to hire 80% of their workforce from that locale. And all of a sudden people were like, yeah, I would like a really good, stable family wage paying job. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you got to present it as not, you're sacrificing for the greater good, but that this is an opportunity for you to get ahead as well. And that we recognize that it's not your fault that you've had generations of people doing this, and now the science is showing that we need to try and transition away. We thank you for providing all this energy, but we have to, help you get into that next line of work in an even better job, and not, as you just said, these jobs be outsourced to some other community and you just be left behind.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right that is a critical messaging thing. But that being said, Natalie, I've certainly enjoyed hearing this kind of approach of, I think language is important. I think that these issues are inherently intersectional, and getting with the opioid epidemic is clearly a big issue, not just for West Virginia, but for the whole nation. And so, I wanted to just give you a moment to plug anything you want. We have the website at the bottom of the page, but for those watching, how are you looking for them to be able to support your campaign?
Thank you for that. Yeah, so we're looking for volunteers, donors. As we talked about before, we're not looking for large corporate donors. So
we don't have many viewers that are large corporate donors.
well, good for you. Yeah, every dollar helps. Every tweet, every Facebook message helps. We just need to get our message out there. So you can go to our website, which is scrolling across the bottom of the screen. You can find me on Twitter, which is at Natalie Klein WV. You can also find us on Facebook at Natalie Klein for Congress, and give us a shout out, share our stuff. There are donate links if you want to donate $1, donate $5, donate what you can. It's time that we all come together and work together for real change that we can feel at home.
Yeah, Natalie, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a pleasure getting to hear from you.
Thank you.
You know what? Yeah, I think a lot of people out there assume, West Virginia is very red, but I think, if you talk to these working class issues, West Virginians and a lot of rural America are smart. They know it's in their best interest. So we hope people will come out and support you. And as you said before, go to the website, NatalieKleinForCongress.com. So,
Thank you.
Natalie, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode of The Hill of Roses. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, please let us know by subscribing to our channel, liking today's video, and sharing the video with your friends. Also, if you want to be notified, please make sure you hit the bell when you subscribe. Finally, if you want to find more of our network's content, please go to thehillofroses.com. With that being said, we love y'all for helping the movement grow, and we hope you're staying rosy out there.